General, sir. By order of the President, you are hereby discharged.
Discharged. During the height of battle.
In the autumn of 1806, the southwestern frontier of the United States was a landscape defined by tension, ambiguity, and the looming specter of war. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 had doubled the size of the young republic, yet it had failed to define the precise boundaries between American territory and the vast, jealously guarded dominions of the Spanish Empire. Nowhere was this geopolitical friction more palpable than at Natchitoches, a dusty trading post on the Red River in the territory of Orleans. Here, the vanguard of the United States Army, commanded by General James Wilkinson, stood practically eye to eye with the forces of New Spain. General Wilkinson, a man whose girth and flamboyant uniforms were as legendary as his purported military prowess, had established his headquarters in this sweltering outpost with a mandate from the Jefferson administration. He was to expel the Spanish troops who had crossed the Sabine River. The Spanish commander, Governor Antonio Cordero y Bustamante, and his subordinate, Colonel Simón de Herrera, had moved their forces into the disputed strip of land between the Arroyo Hondo and the Sabine, a provocation that President Thomas Jefferson viewed as an intolerable violation of American sovereignty. The atmosphere in the American camp was thick with the dust of drilling soldiers and the whispers of impending conflict. Wilkinson, holding the dual authority of commanding general of the U.S. Army and governor of the Louisiana Territory, possessed the power to ignite a continental war. Yet, to the frustration of his officers and the confusion of the War Department, the general hesitated. He delayed his advance, engaged in prolonged, courteous correspondence with Colonel Herrera, and seemed occupied with matters far removed from the immediate tactical situation. Unknown to the soldiers polishing their muskets in the humid Louisiana heat, their commander was paralyzed not by indecision, but by the complexity of his own duplicity. Wilkinson was not merely a U.S. general. He was Agent 13, a long-serving spy for the Spanish crown. For nearly 2 years, he had also been the principal confederate of former Vice President Aaron Burr, engaged in a clandestine correspondence regarding a grand enterprise that promised to reshape the map of North America. The fragile equilibrium at Natchitoches was shattered on October 8, 1806, by the arrival of 2 strangers from the East. Samuel Swartwout, a young and ardent supporter of Aaron Burr, and Peter V. Ogden rode into the American camp carrying a packet of documents that would force Wilkinson to choose between his co-conspirators and his survival. Swartwout, believing he was delivering orders to a loyal ally, presented Wilkinson with a heavy packet. Inside lay a letter written in a complex cipher, a substitution code based on a specific edition of Entick's Pocket Dictionary, authored by Aaron Burr himself. The existence of this letter was the culmination of months of rumors that had swirled through the taverns and drawing rooms of the Atlantic seaboard, rumors of a Western empire, of a secessionist plot, of an expedition to seize Mexico. Wilkinson retired to his quarters to decipher the message. As he translated the symbols into English, the scope of the crisis became terrifyingly clear. The letter, dated July 29, 1806, was a call to action, a declaration that the time for plotting was over and the time for execution had begun. "Everything is to be settled with the officers," the decoded text read. Burr detailed his plans. He would descend the Ohio and Mississippi rivers with a flotilla of boats and an army of followers by mid-November. He expected Wilkinson to be waiting for him, ready to join forces. Crucially, the plan relied on Wilkinson using his position at Natchitoches to provoke a war with Spain. A conflict on the Sabine would provide the perfect pretext for Burr's private army to intervene, ostensibly as volunteers for the United States, but in reality to carve out a new kingdom in Mexico. For James Wilkinson, the Cipher Letter was a death warrant disguised as an opportunity. If he followed Burr's plan, he risked everything. The federal government was already investigating rumors of the conspiracy. The United States Attorney for Kentucky, Joseph Hamilton Davis, was relentlessly pursuing Burr in the courts. If Wilkinson moved to support Burr and the enterprise failed, as it seemed increasingly likely to do given the lack of genuine popular support in the West, he would be hanged for treason. Conversely, the Spanish authorities, his paymasters, were equally suspicious. He had been feeding them intelligence for years, but a full-scale invasion of Mexico led by Burr might be too chaotic to control, threatening the very pension Wilkinson relied upon to fund his lavish lifestyle. The general sat in his tent, the deciphered letter before him, the sounds of the camp filtering through the canvas. The air was heavy with the humidity of the Red River Valley and the weight of his decision. He held the fate of the American West in his hands. He could honor his pact with Burr and launch a revolution, or he could betray his friend to save his own neck. Wilkinson looked at the map of the disputed territory, then at the letter. He began to draft a response, not to Burr, but to the President of the United States. The speed with which General Wilkinson pivoted from conspirator to patriot was a testament to his survival instincts. Having deciphered Burr's letter and assessed the political landscape, he determined that the Western Empire was a sinking ship. He resolved to be the one who fired the cannon that sank it, ensuring he would be viewed not as a passenger, but as the hero who spotted the danger from the shore. On October 21, 1806, Wilkinson dispatched a frantic message to President Thomas Jefferson. In this communication and subsequent affidavits, he revealed the existence of a deep, dark, and wicked conspiracy that threatened to shatter the Union. He enclosed a version of the Cipher Letter, carefully edited to remove the opening sentence which acknowledged his own prior correspondence with Burr. "Your letter was received in due time." By excising this damning acknowledgment, Wilkinson transformed himself from a participant into a shocked observer who had just been approached by treasonous agents. To reinforce his new role as the savior of the Republic, Wilkinson needed to extricate his army from the standoff at Natchitoches. He could not fight Burr's insurgents and the Spanish army simultaneously. In a masterstroke of duplicity, he opened negotiations with Colonel Herrera. Wilkinson approached the Spanish commander with a proposal that was unauthorized by the U.S. government but essential for his personal safety. He suggested that instead of fighting, both armies should withdraw from the disputed strip between the Sabine and the Arroyo Hondo, creating a neutral ground that would remain unoccupied until the border could be settled by diplomats. Herrera, who had no desire to start a war that his superiors in Mexico City might not support, readily agreed. On November 5, 1806, the agreement was finalized. The threat of international war, the very mechanism Burr had counted on to legitimize his invasion, evaporated instantly. Wilkinson had unilaterally secured peace on the frontier, freeing his hands to turn the U.S. Army against Aaron Burr. With the Spanish neutralized, Wilkinson turned his attention to New Orleans. He sent urgent warnings to the city's authorities, describing Burr's force not as a band of adventurers, but as a terrifying armada. "I am not only to march my troops to the protection of New Orleans," he wrote, "but I am to surround it with works of defense." Wilkinson arrived in New Orleans in November 1806 and immediately plunged the city into a state of panic. He declared martial law, bypassing the civil authorities and Governor William C.C. Claiborne, whom he viewed as weak and ineffectual. The general's behavior became increasingly autocratic. He ordered the fortification of the city, demanding labor and materials from the citizenry to build defenses against an enemy that existed largely in his own reports. He began to arrest those he suspected of being friendly to Burr, or simply those he disliked. Samuel Swartwout and Peter Ogden, the messengers who had delivered the Cipher Letter, were seized, denied legal counsel, and thrown into the brig of a bomb ketch in the harbor. Wilkinson ignored writs of habeas corpus issued by the local courts, declaring that the safety of the nation superseded the forms of the law. The city of New Orleans, a cosmopolitan hub of French, Spanish, and American inhabitants, watched in bewilderment as the American general transformed their port into a military camp. Rumors flew that Wilkinson himself was the traitor, that he was preparing to hand the city over to the Spanish, or that he was seizing power for himself. In the midst of this chaos, Wilkinson sent a constant stream of letters to Jefferson, painting a picture of heroic vigilance. He requested money, ships, and authority. He claimed that Burr had thousands of men and was planning to plunder the banks and seize the artillery of the city. As December 1806 drew to a close, Wilkinson stood atop the fortifications of New Orleans, telescope trained upriver, waiting for the Vandals to appear. The suspense was absolute. The nation held its breath, believing that a civil war was imminent. But upriver, the reality was far different from Wilkinson's fabrications. To understand the ease with which James Wilkinson betrayed Aaron Burr in 1806, one must look back 20 years to the origins of his secret life. In the aftermath of the American Revolution, the Trans-Appalachian West, Kentucky, Tennessee, and the Ohio Valley was a region of profound isolation and economic strangulation. The Appalachian Mountains formed a formidable barrier to the east, making the transport of goods to the Atlantic markets prohibitively expensive. The natural economic artery of the West was the Mississippi River. The great river system allowed farmers to float their tobacco, flour, and cured meats south to the port of New Orleans, from where they could be shipped to the world. However, New Orleans was controlled by Spain, and the Spanish government, fearing the encroachment of American settlers, had closed the river to American navigation. For the settlers of Kentucky, this was an existential crisis. They felt abandoned by the federal government in Philadelphia, which seemed more interested in Atlantic trade than in the survival of the frontier. It was in this climate of desperation and resentment that James Wilkinson, a former brigadier general of the Continental Army who had moved to Kentucky to seek his fortune, saw a unique opportunity. In the spring of 1787, Wilkinson launched an audacious commercial and diplomatic gamble. He loaded a flatboat with tobacco, hams, and butter and set off down the forbidden Mississippi River, heading directly for the Spanish lion's den. This voyage was technically an act of smuggling, punishable by the confiscation of goods and imprisonment. However, Wilkinson relied on more than just the current. He carried with him the charisma and cunning that had allowed him to rise through the ranks of the Continental Army and survive the intrigues of the Conway cabal. Upon arriving in New Orleans in July 1787, instead of being arrested, he managed to secure an audience with the Spanish governor Esteban Miró. Wilkinson did not come merely as a merchant. He came as a political broker. In a series of private interviews with Governor Miró and the intendant Martin Navarro, Wilkinson laid out a shocking proposition. He argued that the United States was a fragile coalition that was likely to fracture. The Western settlements, he claimed, were ripe for separation. If Spain would grant Kentucky access to the Mississippi and provide military protection, Wilkinson could use his influence to detach the district from the United States and align it with the Spanish Empire. To prove his commitment, Wilkinson penned a document that would become known as the First Memorial, dated August 21, 1787. In this lengthy text, he analyzed the geopolitical situation of North America with a cold, mercenary clarity. He detailed the weakness of the American Confederation and the growing power of the Western settlers. He warned Miró that if Spain did not ally with the Kentuckians, the Americans would eventually descend the river by force and seize Louisiana. The following day, August 22, 1787, James Wilkinson took the irrevocable step. He signed a formal declaration of allegiance to the Spanish crown. I, James Wilkinson, do swear and promise on my honor to hold myself as a vassal of His Catholic Majesty, the oath read. This was not a vague promise of friendship. It was a formal transfer of loyalty. In exchange for this treason, Governor Miró granted Wilkinson what no other American possessed, a monopoly on trade from Kentucky to New Orleans. Wilkinson's tobacco would be accepted by the Spanish government at generous prices, while his neighbors' crops rotted in their barns. From this moment on, Wilkinson was no longer just an American citizen. In the secret correspondence of the Spanish Empire, he was designated Number 13. The Spanish Conspiracy had begun, fueled by Wilkinson's ambition and funded by Spanish silver. He returned to Kentucky not as a hero of free trade, but as a secret agent of a foreign power, tasked with subverting the very nation he had fought to establish. Throughout the 1790s, James Wilkinson operated one of the most sophisticated and lucrative intelligence operations in American history. His relationship with Spain was transactional. He provided information on American military movements, political sentiments, and expansionist plans, and in return, he demanded hard currency. The sums were substantial. Wilkinson's initial pension was set at $2,000 per year, later raised to $4,000, a fortune in an era when a major general's salary was a fraction of that amount. In addition to the pension, he received loans that were never repaid and payments for specific services. The logistics of moving this wealth from New Orleans to Wilkinson's pockets in Kentucky or Ohio required a clandestine network of couriers and ciphers. One of the most notorious episodes in this illicit commerce occurred in the mid-1790s. The Spanish governor, now the Baron de Carondelet, dispatched a payment of approximately 9,640 to Wilkinson. This sum, in heavy Spanish silver dollars, could not simply be mailed. It had to be smuggled up the Mississippi River, past American customs posts and military patrols. The silver was packed into wooden barrels. To conceal the metallic clink and the true nature of the cargo, the coins were buried inside layers of sugar and coffee. The courier entrusted with this dangerous delivery was Thomas Power, a Spanish subject of Irish descent who served as Wilkinson's primary handler and intermediary. The journey was fraught with peril. Near Fort Massac on the Ohio River, the boat was intercepted by an American patrol operating under the orders of General Anthony Wayne, Wilkinson's commanding officer and arch-rival. Wayne, who strongly suspected Wilkinson's treachery, had ordered his officers to be vigilant for suspicious cargoes coming from New Orleans. When the soldiers boarded Power's boat, the tension was palpable. A thorough search would have revealed the silver and provided the physical evidence necessary to hang Wilkinson. However, the soldiers, perhaps distracted or bribed with provisions, failed to plunge their hands deep enough into the barrels. They saw only sugar and coffee and allowed the boat to pass. The danger did not end there. The boatmen, realizing they were carrying a fortune, turned on the courier. In a brutal act of greed, they murdered the Spanish courier accompanying the shipment and seized the money. When the murderers were later apprehended in Kentucky, Wilkinson's network went into overdrive to cover up the crime. Thomas Power, acting as a translator for the local magistrate, manipulated the testimony of the accused men. He ensured that they confessed to murder and robbery without revealing that the stolen money was Spanish gold intended for the general of the U.S. Army. One of the boatmen was hanged, silencing a key witness to Wilkinson's treason. Wilkinson's service to Spain continued even after he was appointed governor of the Louisiana, territory by President Jefferson. In 1804, while publicly preparing to govern the newly acquired lands, Agent 13 sent a secret report to Governor Vincent Foch of West Florida. Titled Reflections on Louisiana, this document analyzed the American acquisition and offered advice on how Spain could counter American expansion. Most damningly, Wilkinson provided intelligence on the upcoming expedition of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. He advised the Spanish to intercept the explorers on the Missouri River. An express ought immediately to be sent to the governor of Santa Fe, Wilkinson wrote, urging that a detachment be sent to arrest Captain Lewis and his party. He suggested that capturing the expedition would stop American encroachment and demonstrate Spanish resolve. For this specific piece of intelligence, Wilkinson demanded and received a payment of $12,000. While Lewis and Clark navigated the Missouri, unaware of the danger, the commanding general of the army that sent them was actively plotting their capture by a foreign power. While James Wilkinson covertly served the Spanish king, his overt ambition was to command the United States Army. Throughout the early 1790s, the only obstacle to this goal was Major General Anthony Wayne. Wayne, a hero of the Revolution known as Mad Anthony for his tactical boldness, was appointed by President Washington to lead the Legion of the United States against the Native American Confederacy in the Northwest Territory. Wilkinson, serving as Wayne's second-in-command, was consumed by jealousy. He believed himself to be the superior tactician and resented serving under a man he considered reckless and crude. But the animosity was not merely professional. It was existential. Wayne was a staunch patriot who grew increasingly suspicious of Wilkinson's ties to the Spanish and his erratic behavior. Wilkinson launched a campaign of sabotage against his commander that was as relentless as it was underhanded. He cultivated a coterie of officers within the Legion who were loyal to him rather than Wayne. Through these proxies, he spread rumors of Wayne's incompetence to politicians in Philadelphia and to the Secretary of War. He anonymously authored articles in newspapers attacking Wayne's strategy, aiming to erode public and congressional support for the war effort. The treachery extended to the battlefield. During the critical campaign of 1794, as Wayne prepared to engage the Confederated tribes at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, Wilkinson worked to undermine the Army's logistics. He was accused of intentionally delaying supply trains, hoping that a lack of provisions would force Wayne to retreat or lead to a military disaster. On the day of the battle, August 20th, 1794, Wilkinson commanded the right wing of the Legion. While the Americans achieved a decisive victory, breaking the power of the Native American alliance, Wilkinson's conduct remained controversial. In his private correspondence, he disparaged Wayne's tactical decisions, claiming the victory was accidental or poorly managed, continuing his efforts to discredit the commander even in triumph. By 1796, General Wayne had gathered substantial evidence of Wilkinson's misconduct. He had launched an investigation into Wilkinson's Spanish connections and was preparing to bring formal charges. Wilkinson was in a precarious position. A court-martial presided over by Wayne would almost certainly lead to his exposure and ruin. Then, in a twist of fate that Wilkinson's enemies found deeply suspicious, Anthony Wayne fell violently ill. While traveling from Detroit to Pennsylvania in December 1796, Wayne was struck by a sudden, agonizing malady. He died at Presque Isle on December 15, 1796. Wilkinson's reaction was one of undisguised relief. "Prosecution is in the grave with General Wayne," he wrote to a confidant. With Wayne dead, Wilkinson ascended to the position of senior officer of the United States Army. While historians have generally attributed Wayne's death to gout or complications from old wounds, the convenient timing and Wilkinson's knowledge of chemistry, from his early medical studies, have kept the theory of poisoning alive for centuries. The assassin in uniform had effectively removed the last barrier to his power. Once in command, Wilkinson's leadership was characterized by a bizarre obsession with uniformity and a tyrannical enforcement of regulations. In 1801, he issued his infamous General Order regarding hairstyles. He commanded that all officers and soldiers crop their hair short, abolishing the queue, the braided, greased pigtail that had been the standard military fashion since the Revolution. This order was met with fierce resistance from veteran officers who viewed the queue as a symbol of their service and status. Colonel Thomas Butler, a distinguished hero of the Revolution, refused to comply. Wilkinson, perceiving this as a challenge to his authority, pursued Butler with a vindictive fury. He court-martialed the colonel twice, dragging the proceedings out until Butler died in 1805. The haircut controversy became a national scandal, reaching the halls of Congress and eliciting a protest signed by Andrew Jackson, who railed against Wilkinson's persecution and despotism. The episode highlighted the paradox of Wilkinson's character, a man who demanded absolute obedience to arbitrary rules regarding hair, while he himself violated the most fundamental oath of allegiance to his country. Resuming the narrative in the winter of 1807, the tension that Wilkinson had manufactured at Natchitoches and New Orleans was reaching its climax. Wilkinson had convinced President Jefferson and the nation that a massive Burr army was descending the Mississippi to sack New Orleans. He had mobilized the militia, fortified the city, and arrested civilians under martial law. But as January 1807 progressed, the Phantom Army failed to materialize. Instead, a small flotilla of 9 flatboats drifted down the river to Bayou Pierre, north of Natchez. Aboard were not the thousands of Vandals Wilkinson had predicted, but fewer than 100 men, mostly young adventurers and farmers' sons, armed with little more than hunting rifles and fishing poles. When Burr learned of Wilkinson's betrayal, seeing the president's proclamation and realizing his friend had turned state's evidence, he was stunned. "Perfidious," he reportedly cried. The conspiracy collapsed instantly. Burr surrendered to the civil authorities in the Mississippi Territory, where a grand jury, seeing the pathetic size of the expedition and lacking evidence of any treasonous act within their jurisdiction, refused to indict him. However, Wilkinson was relentless. He sent military patrols to hunt Burr down, intent on silencing him before he could speak. Burr fled into the wilderness, disguised in old clothes, but was captured near the Spanish border in February 1807. He was transported under heavy guard to Richmond, Virginia, to stand trial for treason. The trial of United States versus Burr, held in the sultry summer of 1807, was the dramatic centerpiece of the early republic's legal history. Presided over by Chief Justice John Marshall, it pitted the Jefferson administration against the strict constitutional definition of treason. James Wilkinson was the prosecution's star witness. He arrived in Richmond with great fanfare, dressed in a garish uniform of his own design, complete with gold spurs and a sash, looking, as one observer noted, like a mammoth of iniquity. But his confidence was a facade. He knew that the defense team, led by the brilliant Luther Martin, intended to put him on trial. During his testimony, Wilkinson's credibility crumbled. He was forced to admit that he had altered the Cipher Letter before sending it to Jefferson, a revelation that exposed his duplicity to the court. He sweated on the stand as defense lawyers probed his connections to the Spanish. John Randolph of Roanoke, the foreman of the grand jury, was so disgusted by Wilkinson that he remarked the general was a villain, from the bark to the very core, and actively sought to indict him alongside Burr. Wilkinson barely escaped indictment himself. It was only the lack of documentary proof, the Spanish pension records were safely locked away in Havana and Madrid, that saved him. In the end, Burr was acquitted of treason because the government could not prove he had committed an overt act of war. The conspiracy was legally unproven, but morally both men were ruined. Burr went into exile in Europe. Wilkinson returned to his command, his reputation tattered but his office intact, protected by a president who needed to maintain the fiction that the government's witness was credible. James Wilkinson survived the Burr trial, the War of 1812, where his incompetence as a field commander finally led to his discharge, and countless investigations. But the old spy had one final act to play. In 1821, the relentless schemer traveled to Mexico City. Mexico had just won its independence from Spain, the very empire Wilkinson had served for so long. Displaying his trademark chutzpah, Wilkinson presented himself to the new Mexican government not as a former Spanish spy, but as a friend of liberty. He petitioned for a massive land grant in Texas, envisioning a colony where he could rule as a feudal lord. He spent his final years in the Mexican capital, lobbying officials, writing self-serving memoirs that whitewashed his history, and criticizing the United States. He never secured his Texas empire. On December 28, 1825, at the age of 68, James Wilkinson died in Mexico City, likely from the effects of opium he took to manage his varied ailments. He was buried in the church of San Miguel Arcangel, far from the country he had commanded and betrayed. It would take another century for researchers to open the Spanish archives and find the bundles of letters signed number 13, finally confirming the truth that his contemporaries had always suspected. James Wilkinson was the most audacious, successful, and despicable traitor in American history.